Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Human Rights Campaign Vote Equal, Vote Safe event. I would now like to turn it over to our host for the evening, DeRay McKesson.
Hey, everybody. It's so good to be here. It's an honor to have this conversation with the HRC, which is one of the nation's largest LGBTQ organization. And, this is an election that is historic in so many ways. Not only is it an election where we have to think about the political consequences of voting in a way that we haven't seen in a long time, but also an election that's happening in the middle of a pandemic, an election that's happening in the middle of uprisings, in the middle of the street, happening all over the country. So what we know to be true about this election is that it'll be different, that we will not be able to stand outside at polling locations like we have historically. We also know that the whole election process, canvassing, in-person rallies, those things will just look so different than they ever have looked before. So this conversation today is centered on what does that difference look like? How do we make sure that people have access, given that this election will just be different, given the context? And what does it mean that it is such a consequential election for so many people? I'm honored to be joined by a host of people, Congresswoman Ayanna Presley. We have first-time voters. We have Julian Castro. We have a range of people to round out this conversation today to help us really sort of flesh out and think about what does it mean to have a vote that counts? What does it mean to participate? We call this initiative with the HRC Vote Equal, Vote Safe. Which is a campaign aimed at making sure that you have access, that your vote is counted, and that you remain safe and healthy in the process. Now, when we think about this, there are many states that are extending their absentee voting to all voters. We talk about this as like vote by mail is sort of the language. I know that there are a lot of people, especially younger people, even younger than me, who've never sent mail, who haven't bought stamps before. So much of their world is electronic, which makes sense to me. But this will be an election where it'll have to be different. I think about myself as somebody who voted by mail for the first time in Baltimore because, I'd always been able to go to a polling place. And then all of a sudden for the primary, it was like, I guess I got a ballot in the mail. And that was actually just really different than ever before. So I'm excited about this. We know the president has been touting some claims about vote by mail not being secure or that this isn't a good way to go. But I think that this conversation today will help round us out and help us understand that vote by mail is important, but also help us understand so many more things about this conversation that we didn't know. So it's my honor to welcome Congresswoman Ayanna Presley to talk about voting access in the election. So welcome, Congresswoman.
Good to be with you. Thank you, HRC. Thank you, Alfonso.
So, we know you as advocating for civil rights and for the rights of poor people, Black and brown people, about access in general. Now, you've been an advocate for universal vote by mail in your home state of Massachusetts and across the country. Can you tell us, why you think that's an important issue?
Okay, well, first, let me just, picking up on what you were saying, DeRay, about the fact that we find ourselves in an unprecedented moment, and that does demand unprecedented organizing and mobilizing. But to your earlier point offline, it also requires us to be unprecedented in our nimbleness, in our flexibility. And vote by mail, like so many other issues, in the midst of this pandemic, we are now advancing policy proposals that have been unpopular, although they are things that we should have advanced a long time ago, in the name of enfranchisement, in the name of equity, in the name of justice. And so this is something that should have been law of the land in every state a long time ago. But as we are in the midst of this pandemic, experiencing so many unprecedented challenges, this is both essential in the name of enfranchisement, but also in public health. And I can't talk about this without also acknowledging that it's also why we need to continue to push for a federal moratorium on eviction and foreclosure. We find ourselves on the precipice of an eviction tsunami. And so people having shelter is as much about the public health in the midst of this pandemic as it is quite literally about the lifeblood of our democracy. We also find the United States Postal Service being under attack in the midst of this unprecedented pandemic, despite the essential role that they play in community, when I think we should be exploring how to expand the United States Postal Service, not privatizing it. So I just wanted to offer those two things in terms of housing justice and also the United States Postal Service, because they are connected. Now, why have I always been a proponent of vote by mail? In 2018, my campaign was rooted in the belief that we should not make assumptions about who desires or deserves a seat at the table of democracy. We worked intentionally to expand the electorate. We grew the student vote in some parts of my district by 400%. Wow. 26% of that, we grew the Latino vote by 71%. 26% of the voters that participated in our primary, it was the first time they ever voted in a primary. So we expanded the electorate to engage folks who had never voted, who hadn't cast a ballot in a long time. We knew that a lot of folks in our community, contrary to popular opinion, people don't vote because they're ignorant and apathetic and don't know any better. It's not because they know too little, it's because they know too much, because of lived experiences in the aftermath of generations of broken policies, broken systems, and broken promises. So safeguarding the right to vote, making sure that everyone has the opportunity to stand in their power. Again, vote by mail should have been the law of the land, because we were already disenfranchising a lot of individuals living with disabilities, and it was a barrier for many. So this is about safeguarding the right to vote, making sure that everyone has the opportunity to stand in their power, to make their voice heard. As you remind us, D-Ray, no one is voiceless, they are simply unheard. And so casting your ballot is one formidable way to make sure that you are heard. And we cannot allow COVID-19 to be used as an excuse to discourage people from participating in further disenfranchised communities, now more than ever, as activists and young people across the country are taking to the streets to make their voices heard. We need to ensure that everyone has the ability to make it to the ballot box. And that's why I've been a proponent of vote by mail.
That was so much, and so much powerful information. One of the things that you said that I think is really crucial is the attack on the United States Postal Service. And if there's not a postal service, how do you vote by mail? What can Congress do to make sure that the Postal Service is intact, so when we have an election that it is smooth and works? Is there anything you all can do?
Well, this Democratic majority Congress, which has already moved 4 bipartisan bills to in an attempt to mitigate some of the hurt and to provide relief. Again, this is unprecedented in every way, and it is a struggle to meet the scale and scope of the hurt that this pandemic has caused. And our democracy certainly is not an exception to what is being hurt. And so we have passed in the CARES Act specifically, and in future relief bills that will come out of the Congress, a massive investment of federal funds to guard against the USPS going bankrupt. That is as much about them continuing to provide the essential service that they do, delivering medications, delivering the mail, delivering stimulus checks, if we can get these things off of Mitch McConnell's desk and get more money into the pockets of people. But it's also about their families. Privatizing the United States Postal Service or letting it go bankrupt will also contribute to the wealth gap considerably, because these essential workforces, again, are dominated by people of color. So just on the legislative side, outside of COVID and our relief packages, I'm proud that the first vote that I took in Congress was on H.R. 1 to protect voting rights, to expand early voting, to allow for same-day registration, and to require states to set up automatic registration for federal elections for eligible voters. We also voted to pass H.R. 4. I want to bring John Lewis into the room, speaking life and healing and strength to him. But we voted to pass H.R. 4, the Voting Rights Advancement Act. This is critical legislation to restore the full strength of the landmark Voting Rights Act of 1965. Following the disastrous Supreme Court Shelby versus Holder decision, which completely gutted the VRA's ability to combat voter suppression and discrimination. And then again, in the most recent CARES Act, which I was attempting to speak to, although not as eloquently as I had intended to, the most recent CARES Act, the House Democrats ensured that there was money allocated for states to be able to safely administer vote by mail programs and to implement early voting and in-person voting precautions.
Got it. Now, one of the things that I've been interested in is that there are going to be listeners who hear you and they're like, okay, we get it, Congresswoman Presley, we agree. What can I do, right? Is there anything that people in their cities and states can do to sort of pressure their elected officials to do this right? What should they be demanding or asking for?
Yeah, I mean, listen, this is a moment of reckoning. We find ourselves at a tipping point, and we see we're in the midst of a culture shift, which, with the urgency of that culture shift and this movement, is also demanding a power shift. So you are very powerful. And I will just say that, as someone raised by a tenants' rights organizer, a community activist, a super voter, may she rest in peace and power, my mom took me to vote with her in every election. And despite the fact that we were living in the residual aftermath of discriminatory, draconian, and hurtful policies like the war on drugs and redlining and welfare reform, and our struggles with my father being in and out of the criminal legal system and battling substance use, my mother made sure I knew on election day that we were powerful, and I believed her. And when she would pull that curtain and we would walk out, she would say, "Never forget that." I won't tell you exactly what she said, because she used my middle name, and I'm not giving that up. But she would say, "Never forget, we are powerful." And so you are powerful, and make sure that you're a super voter. And as a super voter, that's your superpower, which is what my mother always said. How you hold elected officials accountable is not only by your vote, it is beyond that. Civic participation is not just running for office and voting. Democracy is not a spectator sport. So you have to not just vote in federal elections, but lean in on every race. If you care about racial justice, you need to be participating in your district attorney races. You need to be leaning on your governors and your mayors, because a lot of the things that we're fighting for on the federal level, governors and mayors and election commissioners and police commissioners, they have with the authority, with the stroke of a pen, to effectuate a lot of this change. So I need you to vote. I need you to complete your census. I need you to continue to call Mitch McConnell. Somebody will give you that number. Tell him I sent you, and tell him to do his job, because we have already sent to this GOP-led Senate the sort of investments necessary to strengthen our democracy, to protect it from foreign interference, and to increase access.
So I know that we're coming up on the end of this, but I wanted to ask you, because you've been in the middle of these conversations for a while, Congresswoman Presley, are there any myths that you hear about voting by mail or by voting that you want to dispel, that we should just get in front of? Because there is so much misinformation out there these days.
Well, those are really disinformation campaigns. And again, the foreign interference, those folks have been very busy online in particular. And, we have seen so many of our movements with efforts to infiltrate, to undermine, to negatively connotate, to mischaracterize. And that's just evidence that we are making progress. They wouldn't work so hard to deny us that access, to undermine our democracy, if we were not powerful. And so these campaigns, these disinformation campaigns, these dog whistles about voter fraud, I mean, that is just not real. It's not real. What is real is efforts like by Governor Kemp to steal elections. There's no voter fraud. But what is real is that there are efforts to disenfranchise voters, to obstruct access. And even when we do vote, there are efforts to try to, again, to disenfranchise and to suppress voters. That is very real. But I know that we are powerful. I know that we are engaged, that we are informed. That's another myth. Again, voters don't not show up because they're ignorant and apathetic and don't know better. They don't show up because we make it hard for them, because election day isn't a national holiday, because there is voter suppression and intimidation, and those tactics persist. And again, because not that people know too little, because they know too much based on their lived experiences, and there's a deficit of trust and broken promises. But that's why when we won in 2018, running on a mandate that change can't wait, and that the people closest to the pain should be the closest to the power, driving and informing the policymaking, people said that our victory, our 17-point victory, was a referendum against hate. And what I said in that moment is that no, it was a mandate for hope. And so we have to keep it. We have to preserve and keep that mandate, and that is bigger than any one election cycle. So I believe in the power of the people. I believe in the power of this movement. And I'd be remiss, I wouldn't be doing my job, especially as the child of a formerly incarcerated parent, if I didn't say in our fight for voter enfranchisement, please do not forget about our brothers and sisters behind the walls. I'm going to continue to fight for their enfranchisement, both while they are incarcerated and upon their re-entering into society.
Boom. Well, thank you so much for taking time, Congresswoman Presley. Can't wait to talk to you again. And thank you for being a leader on these issues, helping us understand the power of the government to move and create access for people where there currently isn't any. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for your leadership and your partnership. All right. And Shirley says thank you too.
Oh, yeah, I see.
All right.
Cool. See you later. Now I'm excited to talk to Junior, who is a first-time voter and an HRC youth ambassador. Hey, Junior, how are you doing?
Hey, DeRay, I'm doing well. How are you?
Well, I'm excited to talk to you about being a first-time voter. Before we start with that, what's going on in Arizona in the midst of all the COVID-19 stuff? How are you holding up?
You know, I'm holding up pretty well, but currently Arizona is they're suffering because of COVID-19 and just mainly because poor leadership. You know, thousands of families in Arizona have been suffering because of COVID-19, and we haven't really seen much progression. Right now, Arizona residents and just everyone in this country just needs to be more cautious and aware than ever before. We all really just have to come together and do what's best for the health of our people. And I mean, other than that, it's really hot here in Arizona. It's about it. Yeah.
What is top of mind for you right now as you think about voting? Like, what's important to you? What are you thinking about? What's on your agenda as a first-time voter?
Yeah, well, I'm actually really excited to be voting this year, to be taking part of something that's so valuable to our country. You know, this year is the presidential election, and many, including myself, have voiced their opinions about Trump and the quality of his leadership. And it's clear that our generation and so many other people do not want him to be reelected. And often I hear people, mainly the youth, say, you know, there's no way Trump's going to get reelected. Everyone hates him. Is it really important that I vote? And that's something that scares me because, you know, the facts show that the US has gone 28 years without a president failing to win a second term. And, you know, those are just the facts. So we, the people of this country, need to exercise our rights and take this election seriously. Tuesday, November 3rd, we all need to go out there, do our part, and take action.
Now, what do you say to other young people who are like, you know what, my vote doesn't matter? There are so many other people besides me that what does one vote count? Like, why? Like, that this just doesn't, it's not really an important thing for them to do. What do you say to those people?
You know, it's really, you know, this is our future we're fighting for, and the future of the next generation right after us. And lately there's been a stir in politics, just as you mentioned earlier. Trump was touting that, you know, vote by mail was dangerous and all these other like tactics. But in Arizona, we've actually been using vote by mail, like the vote by mail system, for quite some time. And, you know, it's easy, it's efficient, it's safe. And I've been watching my parents, my family vote by mail for years. And, you know, from what I know, it's a very simple process. You mark your ballot, you seal it in a security envelope, which is nice. And then it can be submitted via mail or in person at designated drop-off locations. And really, if you're not registered to vote, just please register to vote. All it takes is 5 small minutes of your day to register. And if you are able to vote, I urge you to vote. You know, this country needs you. Boom. And one more thing, like, you know, I hear people say, like, you know, like you mentioned, it's just one vote, but because when you cast your vote, you're not only voting for yourself, you're voting for every marginalized community, and you're voting for the future of this country.
Boom. Before you go, Junior, what advice do you have, or like, how do you stay motivated in the midst of such a wild time?
Yeah, you know, staying motivated is quite difficult, but it's easy when you have passion behind it. When you find passion in the current situation, it's quite easy to stay motivated. My advice would be to try and find the good in everything that you can, because there's a lot of bad things out there, but really just try and hone in. Yeah, just try and hone in. Just do what you can to do your part.
There we go. Cool. Well, Junior, thanks so much for joining us today to talk about these issues around voting. I can't wait to talk to you after you cast your vote, and then we'll see sort of how it all shakes out. But thanks so much for being with us today.
Thank you so much.
Cool. I'm excited next to talk to one of the people in charge, Mr. Alfonso at the HRC, to talk about the HRC's commitment, to talk about sort of the work that comes ahead. I don't know how you have such a cool background in your house. Where did you get an HRC backdrop in your living room? But Alfonso, it's so good to talk to you today.
DeRay, it's so good to see you. So good to talk to you. Thank you for hosting this event for us.
No, thanks for being here. It's an honor to be here. Now, can you talk about, let's zoom out a little bit before we sort of talk about voting. You've really expanded sort of the work of the HRC, especially with regard to racial justice, to talk about the importance of the trans community and trans justice initiative. Can you talk about why that was important to you and what that work is?
Yes. So I joined the Human Rights Campaign in August of last year. I took over as president of the Human Rights Campaign. And I thought, and I believe this to my core, it is important for us to strengthen and expand the work because the movement has to represent all of us. So we all know this. As our nation, we've had a frankly shameful past for people of color, for LGBTQ people, but we owe it to ourselves to make sure that movements reflect all of us. And last year when I took over, I traveled the country and I met with activists and talk to them about the challenges that they're facing. They told me that they were being treated as disposable by people who were supposed to be protecting their interests. And they made it clear that specifically transgender people, gender nonconforming people specifically, have been disregarded, not only by the movement at large, but by society. And then since 2013, if we just look at the statistics, when the Human Rights Campaign started tracking the deaths of transgender and gender nonconforming people, so far, we've tracked more than 180 people who've been killed. 180.
Wow.
This year alone, we've already tracked at least 21 transgender or gender nonconforming people killed in the United States. We don't elevate our leaders of the past who were people of color. And I'm talking about Marsha P. Johnson. I'm talking about Sylvia Rivera. I'm talking about Major Griffin Gracie. They were not elevated in the way that they should have been elevated. And they were fighting against police brutality. They were fighting against oppression at Stonewall. And because of them, we have the modern LGBTQ civil rights movement. So when I came in to take over the organization, I felt very strongly that my personal fight for liberation, our fight for liberation, requires all of us. And in order for us to get to that place where we say we actually have achieved equality, we have to fight for people who are marginalized, people who are multiply marginalized by oppressive systems. So that's why you see that we have invested more. We have prioritized issues that are affecting marginalized communities in this country.
Now let's zoom. That makes sense. And, I'd love to continue to learn more about what we do structurally to make sure that the trans community is protected, that people are held accountable when there's harm, and that people have the resources so they can just thrive in society. I also want to zoom in a little bit to talk about how we expand access at the voter box and what that means, and what can the HRC do to help us think about expanding access at the ballot box?
So first, raising awareness, and that's part of why we're doing this event, making sure people understand the options that are available, the challenges that unfortunately exist, and what we can do to change the paradigm. Second, making sure that people understand the importance of registering to vote. We cannot ignore the challenges, but we can certainly overcome them. And in many cases, there are resources available to help people overcome those challenges. And then third, launching this initiative, Vote Equal, Vote Safe. We're working with leaders across the country to educate voters about how they can safely make their voices heard at the ballot box. And it's expanding voter registration options so that we can talk about online voter registration, same-day voter registration. We want to expand vote by mail options. so that it includes, among a variety of things, no excuse absentee voting. Right now in many states, you have to articulate your reason. You have to have an excuse to actually have the ability to cast an absentee vote. We want to change that. We also need to make sure that we count all ballots that are postmarked on or before Election Day. We've heard recently that a lot of those ballots that were submitted, in some cases, were not counted because they were not received. And we need to make sure that when they're postmarked before Election Day, they're counted. We also need to expand in-person voting options, extending early voting times so that we can make sure that people actually have the ability to vote, increasing Election Day polling locations. We saw this recently in Georgia. We saw this in Wisconsin, where there were long lines and people didn't have the ability to actually exercise their constitutional right to vote. So we need to raise awareness. We need to make sure people are registered to vote. And we also need to make sure that we advocate for expanding options that are available for voting.
Now, how do you make sense of the relationship between the current protests and the importance of voting? You know, and I ask because so many of the people who are on the street, I think about myself as one of the people who knew that like voting alone didn't save us, right? That like we voted our whole lives and the police still kill people. There's still mass incarceration. So how do you talk about the relationship between voting and the act of being in the street and civil disobedience?
So I think of it through the same prism. Our voice, we use our voice when we engage in peaceful protests, or we engage in any type of political activity that forces people to engage, right? So when you do that, you're using your voice. But you also need to use your voice at the ballot box. And peaceful protesting plus voting equals change. If the only thing we're doing is protesting, we won't see change. We need to make sure that elected officials who are supposed to be representing our interests are actually there to represent our interests, and we can hold them accountable. Right now, we have partisan politicians who are putting their political interests ahead of marginalized communities and before the health and safety of all of us. We are battling COVID-19. We're seeing the numbers increase in certain parts of the country. And those elected officials who are focused on getting reelected are making it more difficult for us to vote. And we can't hold them accountable, and we can't actually secure our rights if we don't win elections. In order for us to achieve equality, we have to win elections, right? Because the folks that are in office, the folks that are actually representing or supposed to represent our interests are advancing legislative priorities that in many cases undermine us. So we need to hold on to the House of Representatives. We have a pro-equality majority under Speaker Pelosi. We need to get a pro-equality majority in the Senate. We need to take back the White House. And we also need to make sure that we vote in the local elections. We need to combat gun violence. We need to transform the way policing is conducted in this country. But we can't do that if we don't have elected officials that are representing our interests and actually advancing progressive policies. So that's how I see using our voice in protests, using our voices at the ballot box to then affect change.
Boom. Now, one of the last questions I wanted to ask you is, what can people do right now, right? There are a lot of people listening, a lot of people viewing who are like, okay, I get it. Alonzo got it. I believe, but their state doesn't have access, or their friend's state doesn't have access, or city. What can viewers do right now?
1, register to vote. Check your registration. Find out how you can get involved. You can get all of that information at hrc.org/vote. Second, download an application called Team. It's an advocacy app that will help you share your content with anyone in your social network. You can engage your friends or your family in conversations about pro-equality candidates and our cause. Third, volunteer. Every single Tuesday, we call into battleground states using the phone and text to make sure we engage with voters about what's important. And then finally, support organizations that are doing this work, right? Many of us are doing this work across the country. Support organizations that are doing this work. If you do those 4 things, we can affect change. We can make sure that our voices are heard at the ballot box. We can make sure we throw out elected officials that are advancing policies that further suppress us and further oppress us. And I think if you do those 4 things and you engage with your family and engage with your friends, we can really affect change.
Boom. Well, Alfonso, thanks for sticking around. I'm excited to have this conversation next with Michaela, one of the HRC Youth Ambassadors. I'm excited I'm not having the conversation with her. Michaela, you're actually going to have this conversation with Secretary Castro. So I'm excited about all of this. So I'm going to go away for a little bit. Michaela, take it away in this conversation with with Castro about this, and I'll be back.
Thank you, D-Rain. Bye. See you later. Hi, everybody. My name is Michaela, and I'm very, very excited to introduce interview our next guest, Secretary Julian Castro. How are you? How you doing? Can you hear me?
Hey, Michaela, I think it's a little bit scratchy on my end. I'm sorry.
Okay.
But I can hear you now. Hopefully it'll be okay. Thank you so much for having me today.
Oh, yeah. Okay, Secretary Castro, I wanted to talk to you a little bit. What I want to start with is can you give us a little bit about how much representation means to you?
Well, it's a lot. I first got involved in politics because I grew up with a mom who was a Chicana activist, who understood very clearly, like so many people do, that representation matters and that a diversity of perspectives matters when people are representing other people, that it counts. And so for me, I've always seen identity in all its different forms as something to celebrate, and a diversity of people at the table as something that makes policy making, decision making stronger than it would be without that. Also, I would be remiss if I didn't say my congrats to you on using your voice and for the way that you have shown tremendous leadership. You're an inspiration to a lot of folks in my home state of Texas.
Oh, yeah.
I grew up with a mom who very much helped instill in me this sense that we ought to listen to both diverse views, but also people that come from different places and have different identities.
That's awesome. Okay, you've spoken. You've been an outspoken advocate for Latinx folks getting more involved in politics. What would you say to someone who may feel discouraged about participating because of their identity?
I would say that today your voice is more needed than ever before. We see what's out there on the streets, people protesting, a lot of frustration, a lot of yearning for change. After the murder of George Floyd, this was just one more episode that demonstrated to our country very powerfully what happens when you have whole systems that are constructed without a concern, a regard for the value of everybody, no matter who they are, no matter what their identity is. And people in the LGBTQ community know that very, very well. And so do others in our country. And so I would say that if we ever truly want to get to the kind of country that lives up to the best of our ideals, then we need you. We need you as activists. We need you as voters. We need you as leaders. We need you as elected officials. They're making policy and being mindful of the ways that, sometimes when a policy seems either like it's just colorblind or it affects everybody in one way, that actually it affects people differently. The only way that we can have that kind of insight is if we have people of different backgrounds at the table. And I know, especially these days, for a lot of people in vulnerable communities in our country, including very much in the LGBTQ community, it can seem so disheartening because in some ways the old hate has been unleashed over the last couple of years. Not that it ever went away, but it's been unleashed again. But that's when we need your voice even more than ever before.
Yeah, yes, definitely. Okay, what did you learn from running for president?
I learned a lot of things. A couple of things I learned. First of all, I learned that no matter whether people are liberal or they're conservative. Obviously, you know, I was in the Democratic primary and I'm progressive, and so dealt with a lot more liberals and conservatives in the
Oh
Democratic
yeah.
primary. But, you know, whether you're liberal or conservative, people are in the mood for solutions. People want to know, okay, well, how are you going to fix the fact that my family and I can't afford the rent? How are you going to make sure that that my son or daughter can get a good education, or that my son or daughter, no matter what their background is, that they can be safe in school or safe walking down their neighborhood? People are interested in solutions. I also found that the youngest generation is a generation very committed to community and to equality, like fiercely committed to this idea of equality. You know, our nation altogether has moved forward a lot in the last few years, but especially the youngest generation. I think there's a lot of hope there. And then the third thing I'll say is I'll talk about a political thing that I learned, which was just that the person who wins the nomination for their party, and then of course the person that becomes the president, is generally somebody that best meets that moment for whatever reason, you know, but that where voters feel like that's what the country, that's what they need at that moment. And, you know, Vice President Biden, I think, meets the moment. And I saw that very clearly in the presidential primary process.
And as of right now, what would you say that we need in the moment? Can you hear me?
I think, yeah, it started
Oh,
skipping out a second
okay.
ago.
What do you feel like we need right now in this moment as everything going on?
Is that better?
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can now.
Okay. Okay.
Sorry about that. Yeah.
That's all. It's okay. It's okay. Well, I was asking, what do you feel like that we need right now in this moment? What is some things that you feel like needs to be addressed or needs to be fixed?
That we need right now a commitment to each other. I believe that what we've seen is that there are a lot of people in this country who didn't think of themselves as vulnerable, who have found out that actually they are vulnerable to losing their job, vulnerable to losing their health, vulnerable to losing their home as we face an evictions crisis. And what it's going to take for all of us to get through this is a commitment to one another, a spirit of being in this together as a country. It's going to take leaders that are committed to bringing us together, and also a commitment to working together and to making investments in one another to make sure that everybody can prosper. And so I think that we need that commitment. I believe that more than ever before, we need to rely on facts and evidence and science instead of just politics or, you know, opinion or ideology, especially when it comes to something as serious as a pandemic, a national health crisis. And I think also that we need ethical, trustworthy leadership in our country. We need people that people can believe in again.
That sounds good. That sounds great. Okay, you were talking about young people, the younger generation is kind of coming out and really pushing towards, you know, like community. So what would you say to a young person who was kind of wanted to get into politics, or maybe even wanted to get elected into maybe even president? Like, what would you tell us right now so we can start, you know, research, maybe even trying to do community service, or trying to get us ready to be elected?
I'd say that you're not only the future. You hear a lot, young people hear all the time that they're the future, and that's true, but you're also the present. Is that we need you right now. In my experience, young people have the passion, they have the energy, they have a lot of times the knowledge and the zeal right? And the integrity that we need to make big changes in our country. And they also have the opportunity like never before because of our communications tools, because people grow up in many ways faster than ever before. And because people, I think, are looking in a lot of communities in different ways for new leadership. Young people have the chance to impact public policy and the direction of their local community and of our country like never before. And I'm excited at the idea of people stepping up in this time of need for our country and volunteering, running for office also, right? I hope that if folks watching out there, please run for office. They're great organizations, whether it's HRC or Run for Something or a number of others that have helped facilitate folks running. But I would say, believe in yourself. We need your voice. And there's no magic to this. You can do it. You have the talent for it. You have the ability. You have the perspective, and we need that.
Thank you. And one last question. With all the protests happening across the country, can you talk about the importance of protest and how that feeds into voting and how it's still important to vote even with everything going on?
It's all part of making your voice heard and making change in our system. Right? In our democracy, we need people making change everywhere. That's one of the things that I learned from watching my mother and her experience as an activist, right? You needed people on the streets that were pushing the agenda, making people uncomfortable, making the politicians fear that they might lose their office if they don't do something, making businesses understand the importance of certain values and a commitment to serving everybody. So you need folks pushing and also expanding our horizons with a vision. You also need people, in office at city halls and the halls of legislatures and in Congress. You need people in boardrooms. I mean, we saw this week, for instance, that the football team in Washington finally decided to change its name. And what got them to the table basically was years and years of activism, especially by the Native American community, but also at the end by these business partners of theirs that started pulling their investment in advertising and sponsorships. And that was facilitated in part by people in those boardrooms trying to make the argument too. So you need people everywhere, including in the streets, making change. Your protest voice is a voice that makes a difference, but it can only happen too if you have people in office that you vote for that are there to pull the lever and to show us also what can be done with public policy, playing their role. If you only do one, you're not taking care of the whole thing. You can only make change with all of those things.
Ooh, that's a lot right there. Thank you so much. And thank you for authentically answering my questions. They were, I really enjoyed like I said, the authenticity of your answers. Thank you for hanging out with us for a little bit. Handing the mic back over to D-Ray.
Oh, I'm muted. Here we go. Thank you for that conversation, Michaela. Thank you, Secretary Castro. It's always important that we round out these conversations, that we talk to a host of people who are involved in the political process. And let me tell you that it's an honor to have Simone Sanders, who is a senior advisor on the Biden campaign, with us today to talk about these issues. Hi, Simone. How are you doing?
Greetings, DeRay. Can I just say, shout out to HRC for doing this. And when they asked me to do it and they were like, DeRay is participating, I was like, oh, I get, free time to talk to my friends about voting and elections and engaging like the millions of folks in the LGBTQ plus community and voting this November and why they're so important. I'm here for it. So thank you.
Boom. Well, this is an HRC sponsored event, and I would be remiss if I didn't start with a question about how is the Biden campaign going to make sure that the LGBTQ community is protected and cared for, especially coming off the heels of this current administration that is a nightmare for so many people. What will the Biden campaign do to make sure the LGBTQ community is protected?
Well, so Vice President Biden has been very vocal on making sure that the LGBTQ plus community is not only protected, but also engaged and involved in the front end on everything that we are doing. We recently launched Out for Biden, and that is our initiative to mobilize the community to get engaged and get involved and to help make Joe Biden the 46th president of the United States. And we're partnering with folks like HRC to make sure we're bringing that message to the community. But let me be very specific that what the Trump administration has done is an abomination. And on day one, Joe Biden will take action to roll back the atrocities and all of the negative policies. He will start taking action on day one that the Trump administration has put in place that is truly targeted the LGBTQ plus community. Specifically, Vice President Biden will roll back the ban that Donald Trump has established and initiated to ban transgender individuals from serving in the military as service members. He will do everything he can to ensure that we are elevating the voices of LGBTQ plus young people. He will ban conversion therapy. He will put resources in place to ensure that young people have the resources that they need in their communities, in their schools, so that they feel fully supported. And so a Biden administration will be 110% all in on ensuring the rights of the community are underscored, but also, you know, bringing America back to the place where we're truly leading on this issue. Because right now we are not a voice for equality all across the world, because we can't lead by example because we're not doing it at home. A Biden administration would make sure that we are leading by example. We are leading from the front and bringing other people across the world, other countries with us in that effort.
Boom. Now, Simone, what do you say to people who are worried about casting their votes in person this year? Like, how have you been talking about this unique context that we have with the election happening in the middle of a pandemic and the protests?
I mean, DeRay, did you ever think this election would be happening in the backdrop of a global pandemic?
Right. It's still going on. It's still going on. You know, I thought that it might have faded by now. It didn't.
You know, the Trump administration keeps saying it's going to disappear, yet COVID is still with us. I hear everyone talking about coronavirus coming back, and the reality is it's still here. It may become more ferocious this fall, as the scientists have said, but COVID is still with us. But regardless of a pandemic, world wars or whatnot, in America, we have always conducted elections. In times of strife and throughout our history, we have conducted elections, and this year will be no different. And so truly, we believe that folks shouldn't have to be choosing between their public safety and their ability to cast a ballot this November. And we are doing everything we can to ensure that we are defending the rights of folks to go to the ballot box in a number of different ways. And so I am telling folks that you can vote by mail. Okay, but first, before we are even talking about voting by mail, we have to understand and know if we are registered to vote. So folks should make sure they check their registration. You can go to iwillvote.com. It takes literally 5 minutes, and you can check if you're registered. If you're not registered, they'll send you a link to where you can get registered. And after you've done that, I am telling people you have to check where you live. You know, DeRay, I'm in DC right now. I know you're where? Are you in Baltimore? Is this the Baltimore home? DeRay is in Baltimore. The rules are different every place, so we have to make sure we're checking with look, I got another meeting. We have to make sure we are checking with the election commissions in our local communities, doing a little Google search, working with the local entities that are turning out people to vote, because the reality is there are a number of ways to cast your ballot. So if you're concerned about going in person, you can vote by mail. You can early vote. But also, there will still be and need to be safe in-person voting options this November, because as we saw in Georgia, as we saw right here in Washington, D.C., as we saw in Kentucky, people still want to go and cast their ballot in person. And the majority of folks who have gone to the polls in person are people of color, are African-American and Latino folks, are folks who live in urban communities. And we need to protect that ability for those folks to do so, but also do so safely.
Now, last question. I know you got to go. Simone, we're all wondering, what is it like to work in a presidential campaign where it's all virtual? Like, what does that even feel like? What is that like?
You know, I get dressed to come to the kitchen. You know, so it is, you know, the virtual campaign world is, again, unprecedented. It's something we never thought we'd have to do. But I will say I think we've adjusted to this new normal quite well. You know, we believe that connecting virtually does not mean we're not reaching actual people and actual voters. Like, we're connected right now on this, I was going to say Zoom, on a very fancy live streaming platform, but we're reaching real people as we speak. And that is what this is about. And so we are doing virtual rope lines. We're holding virtual rallies. We are doing happy hours. Okay, I've participated in a number of happy hours. Our Out for Biden team has hosted a number of virtual events. And so we are ensuring that even in this virtual world where we cannot see each other in person, where we can't knock on actual doors, that we are still calling people, that we are still staying as connected as possible and organizing, because whether we are ready or not, November is coming. And we need to be prepared to make sure that we are amplifying our voices, that we are lifting up the work that many of our great partners like HRC are doing, and that we all get out there and we vote this November, because all the progress that we're talking about, you all just had Secretary Castro on. I love Secretary Castro. Everything he and others are talking about, none of this happens if Donald Trump gets another 4 years of the last 4 to 7 weeks. And I can't take it, okay? So I'm gonna do everything I can, DeRay, because I can't take it. So I will just say, this virtual Zoom life, it has me be enjoying. I never knew how much I love getting in the car and driving to the Starbucks, okay?
Yes.
Or the coffee shop.
Well, Simone, it was good to be here today. Thank you. Go keep fighting the fight. So we will talk to you another day. Thanks so much.
Absolutely. Thank you.
So I just wanted to give a quick PSA. Remember that you can go to hrc.org/vote so that you can get all the information about registering to vote. You can follow the prompts there to make sure that you're squared away. It's also a good place for you to get the steps around voting by mail, to just like learn. You can also go to your local board of election website and get information there, like Congresswoman Presley talked about, like Simone talked about. You can press your local officials to make sure that you have access to the ballot, to make sure that you can vote wherever you are. And if we want all of our voices to be heard, we have to make sure we're registered. We have to make sure that we participate. We know that voting is not the only way to be involved, but it is a key way to be involved. So as we close, I want to bring back Alfonso so that we can get a little more information about how we go to the next steps, what we do. And Alfonso, can you just like help us close this conversation?
Sure. So as I said before, if you do one thing today, go to www.hrc.org/vote. All of this information that we've been talking about is on that site. We need to make sure we're registered to vote. We need to make sure we check our registration. We need to, if you can and you have the time and the interest, I would encourage you to volunteer. I would encourage you to download the Team app to make sure you engage with your family and friends. Our system is not perfect. Our history is certainly not perfect. But what we want, we will never get if we don't engage in this process of voting. We need to make sure that we fight for the change that we want to see. We have to make sure that we use our voices at the ballot box. We have a movement right now to make sure that Black lives are actually respected and assigned the dignity that we all deserve. But if we have elected officials in office who disregard who we are as people, nothing will change. That's why we have to exercise our right to vote. Please use the website. Please download the resources. Please engage with your family and friends so that we can actually have an opportunity to affect change.
Now, let's see if we can take questions for a couple minutes. If there are any questions, let's see if we can have them come up on the screen, because we know that there are a lot of people who have been participating online. So let's see. So one of the questions that we got was, I agree with Simone, how can we lead the world when our police departments don't observe human rights laws? Exactly right.
We can't put ourselves in a position of leading anything if we don't honor human dignity of LGBTQ people, of Black people, of Latinx people, of marginalized people, of transgender people, and the list goes on. So yes, we have to exercise our right to vote, but once we do that, we also have to hold our elected officials accountable. As we mentioned before, this election is not only about the presidency. This election is about making sure that we change the systems for policing. How do we do that? How do we hold police officers accountable? How do we make sure that we're checking to make sure that the budgets are in line with what we actually want? Vote for city council, vote for mayor. Those things actually will affect change in your communities, in addition to voting for president, in addition to voting for Senate, in addition to voting for the House of Representatives. We need to use our voice at the ballot box to make sure we can lead. I completely agree with that question. We can't lead in anything if we don't honor human dignity.
There's another question, Alfonso, that says, how are you reaching out to colleges and universities?
So we have a program that's called the HBCU program, where we work with historically Black colleges and universities, and specifically LGBTQ leaders of the future. We're working through that program, as well as working with our partners all over the country to make sure we reach out to young voters. And it's not a one size fits all. In every single town, every single city, every single state, the strategy is different. What we're hoping is that people download the application, as I mentioned, Team app, which we know a lot of young people are connected and they are downloading apps, they are communicating virtually. We're asking them to communicate about the election and about voting and why that's important. That's why I keep on raising the Team app. It's a tool that we hope people will use. And just for some context, we found out that the Team app is 9 times more effective than knocking on someone's door on a Saturday morning or a Sunday morning, because you have personal relationships with your contacts. And if you engage them on the election, if you engage them on pro-equality issues, we will be even more successful. So we're using that tool as well as many others to engage with young people.
And Alfonso, where can people go to stay in touch with what you're doing and to make sure they get all the relevant information as the election comes close, but also after the election? People who are aligned with the values of the HRC, where can people go to stay in touch?
So to follow me, it's at Alfonso David on any of the platforms. And for HRC, I would say www.hrc.org. All of our information is on the website, and we will be updating that information as we go through the next few weeks and months.
Boom. Well, thank you everybody for being here. This is a good conversation. This election is an important election, a consequential election. We need to make sure that everybody has access to the ballot box. It doesn't look like that's going to happen in person, but that doesn't mean that it can't happen. Vote by mail is a legitimate way to do it. It's a safe way to do it. And it's a way that we can make sure that everybody's voice is heard. Any final thoughts, Alfonso?
Vote, 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 vote. Please vote.
There we go.
Thank you all.